Way back like 400 episodes ago when we were in Matthew chapter 5, we got to a passage that covers a lot of the same stuff that we're looking at right now in Matthew chapter 23, and this third woe to the religious leaders and the Pharisees. In this particular woe, he doesn't call them that title, he calls them blind guides, but this is the woe about oaths and doing what you said you were going to do and not using weasel words to weaken the notion of an oath so that you can maneuver out of it or maneuver in whichever direction you need to for self-serving purposes or to prop up your side or political party. He's calling them out for that kind of nonsense. We've been talking about it for a few days, but this is the second time we've had this conversation because Jesus dealt with this topic at another point. Now, for this to come up two times at length in the Gospel of Matthew, and you could make the case that the subject comes up in passing in some other places as well, but two times at length, for it to be that big of a deal for Jesus to talk about it that much, that means that in his mind, and probably knowing this would resonate with the people who were listening to him talk, that means that almost surely in his mind, and Matthew editorially chose to include these things, so in the mind of Matthew, in the mind of the audience, who both Jesus and Matthew understood, in everybody's mind, this really was one of the problems. There was something broken about truth and basic personal integrity within the boundaries of the religion that was dominant when Jesus showed up in the early part of the first century AD. And I think when we talked about this last time, we did that whole Princess Bride montage with the horrific voice acting where Wesley is hanging off the cliffs of insanity and Inigo is up there and they have this whole discussion about his word as a Spaniard and I swear by this or I swear by the other thing. The point there being that between Wesley and Inigo in that situation, there were clearly varying tiers of sincerity of oathing. And if you oathed on like this little thing, I mean, come on, that's not really that big a deal. But if you swore an oath on this bigger thing, like, oh, he might do that. And if you swore an oath on like this really big thing, like he's probably going to do that. Throw me the rope. And clearly the text indicates that Jesus has a huge problem with that mentality toward oaths and the truth and all of that. And so to review, in Matthew 5:33, as part of the subsection of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is talking about how your righteousness will have to exceed that of the Pharisees to get into the kingdom. And then he goes on to say, you've heard it said long ago, don't do this thing, but I tell you. And then Jesus goes to the level of the heart to point out that your righteousness can't exceed that of the Pharisees, that their righteousness is indeed false. And even if you were to behave better, you can't control your motives so perfectly that you could be so righteous as to earn or impress your way into the kingdom of heaven. No, your righteousness kind of does need to surpass that of the Pharisees because their righteousness is a fraud. But further at the level of the heart, aren't we all frauds? Don't despair, but instead cry out to Jesus for access to the kingdom. And then on the next page, we get how to swear an oath of fealty, that is the Lord's Prayer, demonstrating your complete dependence and loyalty to the king, assuming a right posture to the king. And that's how this works. Well, one of the examples that Jesus brings up to demonstrate the fraudulent nature of the Pharisees, much more delicately than he does in chapter 23, is this oath-keeping thing that we've been talking about for the last few days. And so Matthew 5:33 says, again, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, don't break your oath, but keep your oaths you've made to the Lord. But I tell you, don't swear at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And don't swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Now, you remember a couple of days ago, we were talking about, just in summary here, that all of the stuff that is truthy and in the light, that is held out by the text, by Jesus, as being from God. God does truth things where you can see it and evaluate it. The father of lies does lying things in the darkness, and confusion and muddying the waters are the trademarks of how he deals with truth propositions, or as it is, lying propositions. Somewhat more gently then in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is saying these practices of overly complex oaths, I swear by this, I swear by this, I swear on the soul of my father, Domingo Montoya, that all of these things are really just theater, it's play acting, it's nonsense. It should be as simple as if you say I swear, there doesn't need to be a thing that comes after that. Like, you already swore. Anything else is just silly and caveating and demonstrates that most of the time you don't actually mean what you say. And I use this phrase too, but man, I cringe when I catch myself saying, all right, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. Like, I hope I'm always telling you the truth. But in some ways, lest I get on my high horse, that's one little phrase that I use that maybe could betray that there are different levels of honesty, different levels of integrity that I might employ depending on the social circumstances. Well, that's the accusation against the religious leaders here. Now, notice that in the Sermon on the Mount, where this passage we're looking at in Matthew 5 occurs, Jesus went up onto a mountainside after he saw the crowds, and he sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying. So the Pharisees are bystanders here, and there's nothing directly conscious of them here. There are a few twists of the needle that are pointed their direction, like pointing out their hypocritical prayer and other things like that. We heard a couple of weeks back on that very well-preserved recording how much those little jabs with the needle agitated and were noticed by Jeff the Pharisee, who is entirely fictitious in case you didn't catch those episodes. So the point of contrast here is pretty simple. In chapter 23, the Pharisees are standing right there, and this is for everybody to hear because we're just going to deal with this thing right now because it's been a fraud. But this is not a change of message. Jesus has been saying this stuff from the very beginning. In fact, he says this on page 2, according to my Bible, of public things that he said. Within the first few hundred words of anything he said at all after he went big and went public, this was that high on the list that he wanted to call it out. And again, his antidote to this truth crisis being proliferated by the religious leadership was just to simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Why? Because the evil one is the father of lies, and anything beyond, yeah, I'll do that, or yeah, that's exactly what happened, or no, I won't do that, or no, that's exactly not what happened, is at its heart hedging, is at its heart caveating, is at its heart dishonesty. And what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5 and also in Matthew chapter 23, it's not like this is novel. It's not like this is some new approach to truth that he's proposing. I mean, I guess you got the 10 Commandments, and Exodus chapter 20, you got I have to count them. What would this be, the 9th commandment? I don't know. We didn't memorize them that way in Sunday school. I'm embarrassed. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. That's pretty straightforward. Seems like what Jesus is saying is in keeping with that, though it looks as though some people had tried to narrow the scope of what is in view in Exodus chapter 20 over the ensuing centuries to be like, well, that's like about court cases and being a witness, and you want to have multiple witnesses to trust but verify. That's how that works. But even if you try to make that case, personal integrity is something that gets spoken to in Numbers 30, and everybody in the original audience would have been in the loop on this. Numbers 30, verse 1, Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands." All right, so this is from God. "When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said." So again, when Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, I mean, the plain and simple reading of the law of the Old Testament was in keeping with what Jesus was saying. And the weird, twisted up, gross version of modern religion that was present at the time was not in keeping with what the Bible was saying, was not in keeping with what Jesus was saying. And so really, he was calling them toward, again, repentance. Like, turn back to this thing that was truer and realer and more reflective of kingdom values, and quit not just being smarmy, but, and I think this is where we'll land the plane on all of this third woe stuff. It's not just about that you're weaseling and you're being smarmy. It's about this runs truth through the ringer. It makes a mockery of things. It creates an epistemological crisis, that meaning that a society loses its ability to tell truth from falsehood, and truth becomes a thing that is convenient at times, and at other times inconvenient. Truth becomes something that is bridled and brought completely into the service of the good of the party. Even all religion aside, you start messing in society with the basic units of 1 and 0, on, off, true, false, that all of binary logic on which existence is structured is based. You're messing with stuff that strikes to the core of everything. And in just a couple chapters here, when Jesus is on trial-ish before Pontius Pilate, I mean, what does Pilate say about all of these truth claims? I mean, what is truth? He just shrugs at the whole thing. Dude's so beat down by what everybody in his line of work has done with truth. This mentality about keeping your promises, lying, truth, and falsehood, It is so pervasive, and the very notion of truth has been so abused in this culture at this time that all Pilate can do is even shrug and scoff at the notion that such a thing could even exist. Truth is whatever powerful people need it to be in a given moment. Truth is whatever the idiot mob has been whipped into a frenzy to think in a given moment. And Pilate, who's a fairly sophisticated guy, can read the room well enough to know that there's not even any point in going down the road of truth. So it seems picayunish that we would take 4 days to talk about this passage. It seems picayunish that we would jump all over the Bible to talk about this passage. I'm not doing so because you need a lecture on being more truthful. I probably need the lecture on being more truthful. It's important, and Jesus lingers here for what by my count is the longest of the woes, because their behavior on this point exemplifies why they are blind guides. They're blind because they can't see truth, and they can't see truth because they wrecked truth on purpose because they thought it would benefit them, yet they still presume to hold themselves out as people you should follow. And chipping away at our shared notion of truth anytime it benefits us, that has actual consequences. That has backlash to it. Yes is yes, no is no. There really shouldn't be any need to swear this way or that way. And this isn't just some deal that Jesus thought of at the last second. He thought about it from the very beginning and prioritized it highly when he first went in front of people, as recorded back in chapter 5. And now, on his way to the cross, he is still pointing this out as evidence that the Pharisees are on the wrong side of truth and that people should not follow their example when it comes to how to think about what is real, what is not, what is truth, and what is a lie. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.